He looked embarrassed. He accused me of lacking moral courage, of watering down the scriptures. He believed the church had lost its edge. Did he mention his Bible? The vicar blinked. The one he brought to donate? Yes, he seemed quite protective of it. Reverend Humble nodded slowly. He said it was a rare edition, annotated in the margins by someone quite scholarly, though he wouldn't say who. He was particularly insistent about the Book of Psalms, said it had been marked deliberately for a reason, though again, he offered no further detail. Did you ever see what was inside? No. The vicar said firmly. He kept it close when I offered to keep it in the vestry for safekeeping. He laughed. This book is safer with me than behind your altar, he said. Then he walked off. I thought it was eccentricity. Miss Marple allowed a silence to form, not long enough to be uncomfortable, but enough for the vicar's mind to drift. He sat back with a sigh, looking older than his years. I suppose the police believe I'm a suspect, he said quietly. She looked up, her expression unreadable. They haven't said so. They don't need to. I had a public dispute with the man. The village saw it, and now he trailed off. Miss Marple placed her cup down gently. People argue, Reverend. They disagree, often passionately, but very few go from theological debates to murder. And those who do usually lack your sense of pastoral restraint. He looked at her sharply, but only nodded. She rose soon after, offering her thanks and retreating with the same quiet grace with which she had entered. As she made her way back into the village proper, she found herself intercepted by Colonel Marchbanks, who was standing outside the post office in a state of stiff agitation. "Oh, Miss Marple, just the woman. Have you heard of it?" She offered a patient smile. "That depends on what one is meant to have heard. Colonel, they've taken Meg into questioning. The maid from the vicarage garden. That poor girl's shaking like a leaf. And for what? Seeing a shadow. What prompted that? They found her handkerchief near the arbour, lace-edged, with her initials." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Is that not precisely what one might expect, given she was the one to find the body, one would think?" The colonel huffed. "But young Lennox is far too eager to find a quick culprit. He believes the handkerchief was dropped in a moment of panic after committing the crime." Miss Marple murmured. "Was there any blood on it?" "No." "Then how curious. A person so careful as to commit a murder without a trace, and yet careless enough to leave behind something as personal as a monogrammed handkerchief." Colonel Marchbanks blinked. "Well, when you put it that way, quite." She thanked him and moved on, her mind turning. The police were circling their first real suspect. And it was the wrong sort of one, not because Meg was incapable, though she likely was, but because the scenario did not fit. Meg's scream had been genuine. Miss Marple had seen the way the girl's whole body recoiled, the tremble in her hands, the strange hollow tone in her voice. But more importantly, Meg had nothing to gain. She walked next to the green, where the old wooden bench overlooked the duck pond. There she found Amelia Marchbanks seated with a book in hand. Though she didn't appear to be reading, her eyes were fixed on something in the middle distance. "Mrs. Marchbanks," Miss Marple said gently, sitting beside her. "You knew Mr. Simmons some years ago, did you not?" The older woman turned slowly. "Yes. We were acquainted, long ago, before he went to Egypt." Mrs. Marchbanks's lips tightened. "Before he left everything behind." "Yes." Miss Marple waited. "Benedict was once engaged," the woman said at last, "to someone I knew very well. He broke it off quite suddenly and fled to Cairo, left nothing but a note, no explanation, no apology. And yet he came back. I suspect he never quite escaped what he fled from, or whom." Miss Marple looked at her carefully. "You don't seem particularly grieved." "No, I grieved him years ago. He died for me long before yesterday." A pause passed between them, filled only by the low quacking of ducks. Did he say why he returned? Only that he was putting things right. He wouldn't explain further, but there was something nervous about him, as if time were running out. Miss Marple stood again, her knees a touch slower than in years past. "Thank you, Mrs. Marchbanks. You've been most helpful." By dusk, the picture was taking shape. A man returns after decades abroad, carrying a rare Bible and hinting at hidden truths. He tries to make amends, or perhaps confessions. He is killed. Publicly, symbolically, in a garden full of people, yet in complete privacy. A maid is accused, a vicar is doubted, and a once broken engagement flickers back into relevance. But something didn't fit. Not yet. Miss Marple paused outside her cottage gate and looked up at the sky. A storm was forming behind the hills, clouds thick and grey. Secrets, she thought, had a way of building like storms, quiet at first, then suddenly and violently. Tomorrow she would speak to someone who had, so far, said very little. Young Timothy Cooper, because sometimes the people who watched the most were the ones no one thought to question. The following morning broke with a fresh wind, curling around the gables and hedgerows of St. Patrock's Rise. It carried with it the scent of turned earth and the faint brine of the sea beyond the fields. The rain had passed overnight, leaving behind a film of dew on every leaf and stone. As the sun slipped through the thinning clouds, it cast long golden streaks over the village green, and with them came renewed activity, measured, careful, as though people now moved beneath invisible scrutiny. Miss Marple, who had always believed that early walks gave one an advantage both moral and practical, left the cottage just after 8. She passed the church, its spire catching the morning light, and made her way down Church Lane toward the school. She was not there to observe the children, not exactly. Young Timothy Cooper, freckled, impish, and brimming with opinions far beyond his age, had taken to loitering around the scene of the crime on the day of the garden party. He had been underfoot at every table, appearing where cake was plentiful, and vanishing before chores could be assigned. It was not his presence that struck Miss Marple as odd, it was the timing. She found him precisely where she expected, perched on the low wall near the blacksmith's cottage, legs swinging, fingers sticky with jam from a stolen piece of toast. His gaze was fixed intently on a cluster of sparrows pecking in the grass. But he turned as she approached. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, a little too cheerfully. "Good morning, Timothy. Skipping lessons today?" He grinned, unrepentant. "Miss Crane said we could stay home if we weren't feeling quite right. She's been funny ever since the murder." Miss Marple sat beside him. The stone was cold through her skirts. Quite right of her. It's a troubling thing, death in such close quarters, particularly when it's not natural. Timothy didn't answer immediately. He picked up a twig and began scraping it against the mortar between the stones. "I suppose you saw something at the party," she said lightly. "You were everywhere, weren't you?" His hand froze briefly. "Didn't see anything important. That's often the best kind of seeing." He glanced at her sideways. "You don't think Meg did it, do you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think Meg screamed to honestly to be guilty. But I also think someone may have seen something they weren't meant to, and not known it at the time." Timothy hesitated, then dropped his voice to a whisper. "I saw Mr. Simmons with a letter just before the party started. He was in the arbour, reading it, real focused, like it was the last thing he'd ever read. He put it in his Bible when he thought no one was looking." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Was it still there when the police found the book?" He shook his head. "Constable said it was clean. Nothing inside but the ribbon." She gave a thoughtful nod. "Thank you, Timothy. That was very brave to share, and quite clever." He beamed, chest puffing a little. "I knew it was important, but I didn't want them to think I was nosing. You were doing exactly what a good witness does, watching and remembering." She left him with a peppermint lozenge and continued her walk, her thoughts racing ahead. There had been a letter, of that she was now sure. Mr. Simmons had brought it with him, perhaps hidden it deliberately. But sometime between that private moment in the arbour and the moment his body was discovered, the letter had disappeared, the Bible had been kept, the ribbon left in place, so whoever took the letter had wanted it gone, but not obviously so. A thief might take the entire book. A killer with intent would take only the message. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a single word beneath her list of names. It was time to return to the Bible that afternoon. She paid a polite visit to the Chillingham Constabulary, where Inspector Lennox sat behind a modest desk surrounded by an impressive disarray of files and teacups. "Miss Marple," he said, standing with practised civility, "to what do I owe the pleasure? I hope to inquire after the Bible recovered from the crime scene. I understand it's in your custody." Lennox's eyes narrowed, but only slightly. "It is." The vicar confirmed it was the same one Mr. Simmons attempted to donate. "Do you suspect something?" "I suspect," she said gently, "that people often hide things in the most visible of places." "I would like to see it again, if I may," he considered. This, then gestured to a cabinet. From within, he produced the Bible, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Miss Marple handled it carefully. Pitchocks rise, giving every object a sharper edge. Hedgerows looked pricklier, cobblestones more uneven, and the faces of passing villagers more watchful. The murder of Benedict Simmons had not yet faded into the backdrop of the villages. Slow routine, if anything, it had settled deeper into the folds of daily life, touching even the most ordinary moments with suspicion. Miss Marple had spent the early hours reviewing her notes at the small desk by the bay window of her niece's cottage. The evidence was not concrete, nor was it meant to be, in her experience. It was not scientific proof, but the quiet inconsistencies of human nature that revealed truth, and she had begun to detect a pattern, one stitched not with forensic detail, but with motive, timing, and character. By mid-morning, she made her way to the solicitor's office Chilton and Lacey had occupied, the red brick building on High Street for nearly a century. It had the sort of respectable facade that announced permanence rather than prosperity. Inside, the carpets were thin but clean, the furniture dark and practical. Behind the reception desk sat young Mr. Harold Lacey, son of the late Arnold Lacey, who had served the village's legal needs for decades. Harold Lacey stood as Miss Marple entered, smoothing his tie. "Miss Marple," he said, tone polished but cautious. "What can I do for you?" She returned his smile with one of her own. "Only a small inquiry, Mr. Lacey. I understand your firm once handled the affairs of Sir Reginald Marchbanks." "We did, my father." "Rather, I was just a boy at the time, but I've since reviewed the files. And was there ever mention of a secondary will, something revised or concealed?" Harold paused. "There was some rumour of such, yes. My father made an entry in the case ledger about a possible amendment, but no document was ever officially filed." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "Because Mr. Simmons seemed very certain that he had legal standing, perhaps from a will that never made its way through the proper channels." Harold's eyes darkened. "That would be impossible. I'm afraid, if such a will existed, it was never deposited here, not even in your father's private files." He shifted slightly. "Those were sealed when he passed. I've gone through most of them by now, nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple studied him. "And if a document were discovered, let us say, something naming Mr. Simmons as an heir, what would that mean for the current beneficiaries?" Harold gave a small, professional smile. "That would depend on the date and legal standing of the document. If valid and more recent, it could override the prior will. But it would also raise questions why it was withheld, who had access, whether There had been interference. I see, Miss Marple said quietly. It's a great responsibility, handling such papers, and a heavy temptation, perhaps, to manage them selectively. His smile tightened. I take the law very seriously, Miss Marple. I'm sure you do. She took her leave shortly thereafter, sensing no benefit in pressing him. But she had seen the flicker behind his eyes when she mentioned interference, the faint, almost imperceptible shift when the subject of concealment rose. He had known more than he admitted, though whether it was knowledge of the original testament or something far more recent remained unclear by afternoon. The village had gathered itself again around its routines. The shops were open, the church. Bells rang softly for a midweek prayer, and life pushed forward. Though always with one ear bent toward the past, it was then that the twist arrived, not as a dramatic pronouncement, but as a quiet knock on Joan's cottage door. Miss Marple answered it to find Lydia Crane on the step, her hair damp from the breeze and her eyes wide with something that was not quite fear, but certainly bordering on it. "May I speak with you?" Lydia asked, her voice thin. "Of course, my dear, come in." Lydia perched at the edge of the armchair, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles were white. "I've remembered something," she said. "I don't know if it matters, but I didn't know who else to tell." Miss Marple waited. 2 days before the garden party, Lydia continued, "I saw Mr. Simmons outside the schoolhouse. He wasn't there to speak with the children. He was meeting someone. They didn't see May was behind the curtain, but I watched them speak. Who was it? Harold Lacey." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind stirred. "Go on." They weren't arguing, exactly, but Mr. Simmons seemed frustrated. He handed Harold something, a paper or envelope, and Harold read it. Then he tore it in half. "Tore it," Lydia nodded, and then Mr. Simmons shouted at him. "I couldn't hear what was said, but it looked serious. Did you see where they went afterward?" Harold walked off toward the high street. Mr. Simmons just stood there, looking defeated, like he'd been robbed of something precious. Miss Marple sat back, absorbing the information. This changed the landscape considerably. She thanked Lydia and sent her off with a warm scone from Joan's pantry and a quiet word of reassurance. When the door closed, Miss Marple sat still for a long time. Now the threads came into focus. Simmons had returned not just to right a wrong, but with a specific document. He had presented it to Harold Lacey, perhaps seeking to confirm or file it. Harold, young, ambitious, and likely aware of the consequences such a document could have for his clients, and perhaps himself destroyed it, and yet Simmons had made a copy, or at least a record. Hidden, perhaps, in the Bible, or transferred through inference. That meant there was still a trace, something left behind, and then he died. Harold had a motive, certainly, a desire to protect his reputation, or perhaps someone else's legacy. But was he capable of murder, or had someone else acted, knowing what Simmons possessed? Miss Marple glanced at the list of names once more. There were still questions, still shadows, but the light was beginning to fall differently across the story. Tomorrow she would attend the church's afternoon prayer meeting, not for the sermon, but for the seating. Sometimes, in the silence of Scripture, people reveal more than they ever would in conversation. Because Miss Marple had seen the pattern now, a broken will, a broken promise, and someone, somewhere, whose hands were not stained with blood but with ink. The air inside St. Patrock's Church was cool and scented with old stone and polish. It was a modest place of worship, nothing grand, but it possessed a dignity rooted in the rhythm of quiet lives. Candles flickered in iron sconces. The stained glass windows, long faded by sun and time, cast patches of muted colour on the flagstone floor. It was Thursday afternoon, and the midweek prayer meeting had drawn a small but faithful gathering, a handful of parishioners. Fill the pews with bowed heads, murmuring responses in soft voices. Miss Marple arrived precisely 2 minutes before the service began, seating herself 3 rows from the front, to the left of the aisle. She did not close her eyes. Instead, she observed. Reverend Humble stood at the lectern, his voice echoing gently across the nave. He read the Psalms with care, his delivery solemn and rhythmic, but Miss Marple's attention was not on the scripture, it was at the congregation. Amelia Marchbank sat rigid and upright at the far end of the front pew, her back unbending, her prayer book held as though it might shield her from the world. Mrs. Weatherby sat 2 rows behind her, whispering responses with pious fervour. Young Timothy Cooper was there too, squirming beside his mother with forced reverence. Lydia Crane sat at the edge, near the stone pillar, her expression pale and preoccupied. And then there was Harold Lacey. He arrived 5 minutes late, slipping quietly into the rear pew. He bowed his head and joined the congregation as if nothing at all was unusual, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward the altar only after surveying the room. He was not here to worship. He was here to watch. The service proceeded with all its usual calm, prayers for guidance, a brief reflection on mercy, a hymn or 2, sung quietly and without much conviction. But when Reverend Humble reached for the Bible resting on the lectern, a hush fell over the nave. The Book of Psalms lay open, a ribbon marking the centre, and then, as if on cue, the vicar read aloud the verse Miss Marple had requested the day before, under the polite pretence of theological curiosity. Let his days be few, and let another take his office. A pause, a shift in the atmosphere. Miss Marple did not look at the vicar. She turned instead to glance, very gently, toward the back of the church. Harold Lacey had frozen. It was no more than a second, perhaps 2, but in that moment he had stilled completely. His fingers clutched the edge of the pew. His jaw had tightened, and then, as quickly as it had come, the tension eased, and he bowed his head once more. But it was enough. Miss Marple's final test had revealed what she needed. That verse, the same one marked in the Bible found beside Benedict Simmons, was not one known for comfort. It was a declaration, a challenge, and for someone who had tampered with the testament of another, it would land like a blow. She stayed after the service. Lingering in the small chapel off to the side, she admired the embroidery on the altar cloth, chatted briefly with Mrs. Weatherby about the difficulty of keeping garden roses from spotting in early spring, and declined tea at the vicarage with quiet regret. Then, when the church had emptied, and only the last notes of the organ echoed faintly through the nave, she turned and found Harold Lacey standing at the back, adjusting his coat, preparing to leave. She approached him without a "Mr." The leather was cracked, the gold-embossed lettering faded with age. She opened it to the Book of Psalms. The ribbon still lay across Psalm 109, its end slightly frayed. Then she saw it. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss, but as she turned a few pages before and after the marked spot, she noted a faint linear pressure mark, as if a smaller slip of paper had once been folded there. And then, tucked into the inside back cover, almost invisible against the aged leather, was the faint outline of adhesive residue. "May I borrow a magnifying glass?" she asked. Inspector Lennox obliged. With the lens, she examined the back cover more closely. There, hidden against the inner spine, was the partial impression of handwriting. It had transferred, faintly, as ink sometimes does when pages are pressed together over time. The words were fragmented, barely legible, but one phrase stood out, must never be found out. The Testament. Miss Marple lowered the book slowly. "Testament," she repeated. "Not the biblical kind, I think. A different sort of testament, the kind written in ink, signed before witnesses." Inspector Lennox leaned forward. "You're suggesting there was a will?" "I suspect there was more than a will. I suspect there was a secret so potent that someone killed to bury it. But we found no legal documents on Mr. Simmons." "No," she said. Because someone took great care to remove them, she handed the Bible back and rose. "Thank you, Inspector. I believe I've seen what I needed." As she stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Miss Marple felt the pieces shifting again. The letter, the phrase insomslet another take his office, and now the word testament, faint but unmistakable. A will, perhaps, but also a reckoning. Mr. Simmons had come back to do something. To name something or someone, and that person, fearing exposure, had acted before he could speak. Now the question was no longer who disliked Mr. Simmons, it was who had something to lose, and who had everything to gain. Miss Marple turned down the lane, her steps slow but steady. The truth, she knew, was never buried too deeply, not in a village like this. It only needed the right eyes to see the shape of it. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to Mrs. Prowse, the housekeeper who had once served the Marchbanks family. A woman with an impeccable memory and a gift for silence, because sometimes the past didn't just echo, it left fingerprints. The following day broke with a strange stillness, the kind that often precedes a shift in the weather or in fortunes. The usual sounds of village life felt muffled. Even the sparrows seemed to chirp with less conviction, as though they, too, were listening for something unsaid. In St. Patrock's Rise, such quiet often preceded gossip, and gossip, Miss Marple knew, was a prelude to truth filtered through prejudice. Stretched by imagination, but always based on some kernel of human nature. That morning, she took her usual route past the green and toward the south end of the village, where old ivy-stitched cottages clung to narrow lanes and stone walls bowed under years of weather. Her destination was Fernside Cottage, a modest but tidy dwelling with lace curtains and a garden of bluebells growing wild along the path. It belonged to Mrs. Prudence Prowse, retired housekeeper of the Marchbanks estate, and a woman whose discretion was matched only by her memory. Mrs. Prowse answered the door with her usual air of brisk capability, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Marple," she said, slightly surprised but not displeased. "Do come in, I was just putting the kettle on." Inside, the house smelled of beeswax, lavender, and something faintly medicinal. Perhaps liniment. The sitting room was small but orderly, with a well-thumbed copy of Pilgrim's Progress resting on the side table. Miss Marple sat where directed, accepting tea and a shortbread biscuit. "I expect you know why I've come," she said after a pause. Mrs. Prowse's eyes, pale and sharp despite her years, did not waver. "If I had to guess, I'd say it concerns Mr. Simmons, and a document." The older woman hesitated, then placed her cup gently down on its saucer. I wondered when someone would ask. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "You see," Mrs. Prowse continued, "I was there the summer Benedict left, 40 years ago now. Just before he vanished to Egypt, there was talk even then." "What sort of talk?" Mrs. Prowse folded her hands. "He'd grown close to Samiani Amelia." "Yes, but not only her. He was seen in private conversation with the elder Marchbanks, Sir Reginald, and once I overheard them speaking of an agreement, something formal, a will." Mrs. Prowse nodded. "That would be my thinking. Sir Reginald was growing frail. He'd lost his first son in the Boer War, you know, and the other had no head for estates. There was a rumour, unspoken but persistent, that Benedict might be made heir in some fashion. Not blood, but close. And then Benedict left, vanished, more like, just after Sir Reginald's sudden illness, and the talk stopped, but the air never quite cleared." Miss Marple considered this quietly. "Do you believe he came back to claim what he was promised?" "I believe," Mrs. Prowse said slowly, "that he came to unearth something, perhaps the will, perhaps guilt. He was a haunted man. I saw him a fortnight ago. Came to see me, asked about the old estate documents, wanted to know if anything was ever kept outside the solicitor's hands. I told him no, but I could see he didn't believe me. Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. Do you think Mrs. Amelia Marchbanks knows more than she has said? Mrs. Prowse's lips tightened. Miss Amelia is a proud woman, proud and controlled. She would never admit to scandal, not even to herself. The conversation drifted into silence, both women lost in thought. When Miss Marple left, she carried more than just information. She carried confirmation. Benedict Simmons had been more than an eccentric scholar. He had been a potential heir, perhaps even a rightful one, and someone had known. That afternoon, as the village moved through its errands and afternoon teas, Miss Marple paid another visit. This time to the vicarage, not to see Reverend Humble, but to speak with Meg, the maid, now returned from her brief and unsettling questioning by the constabulary. Meg, a timid girl of 19 with nervous hands and a tendency to stammer, met her in the kitchen. I just want to help, she whispered, but they don't believe me. They say I had risen opportunity. Miss Marple took her hand gently. You were frightened. You saw something that startled you. Didn't you? Meg nodded. I saw someone come from the arbor just before I screamed. Do you remember who? No, she said, tears welling up. Only the coat, long, dark green, with a velvet collar, like the one Mrs. Marchbanks wears in Evensong. Miss Marple didn't flinch. Thank you, my dear. That's very brave of you. She left the vicarage slowly, thoughts turning like the hands of a clock. A velvet-collared coat, a will, a missing letter, and a woman once promised something, only to be denied. It was time for a confrontation. Later that evening, Miss Marple arrived at Marchbanks Manor, the great stone house that had once been the pride of the district. It had faded with age, like the family within it. Though it still bore the air of understated defiance, the drawing room had changed little over the decadesol portraits, damask curtains, and a hearth that whispered of old coal fires and older secrets. Amelia Marchbanks stood by the window, her back to the room. You've come to accuse me, she said without turning. Miss Marple closed the door softly behind her. No, I've come to understand you. Amelia finally turned. Her face was pale, composed. Her hands trembled slightly. He returned to remind me of what I lost, she said, of what he left behind. You cared for him. I loved him, she said bitterly. And he left me for sand and scrolls and a life without obligation. And now he returns, with hints of inheritance and redemption, as if years can be erased like chalk from a slate. Did he bring a will with him? Amelia's eyes met hers. He said he had proof that my father had named him the heir, that he would claim what was his and restore what had been promised. But that would have meant exposing family shame, challenging everything my father built. You confronted him. I did. The morning of the garden party. I told him to go, to leave this place in peace. He said he would not. That he had already hidden the testament in the one place the church could not ignore. Miss Marple's voice softened. The Bible. Amelia looked away. I didn't kill him, she said, voice breaking slightly, but I wished I had, at that moment. Miss Marple said nothing. Silence could be as revealing as confession. When she left the manor, the sky had begun to darken with the approach of another storm. The wind had picked up, rustling through the hedgerows like a warning. Amelia had not killed Benedict Simmons. Of that, Miss Marple was now certain. She had too much dignity to murder. But someone else, someone watching that garden closely, had seen the opportunity. The person who had everything to lose if a new will surfaced, and everything to gain if it vanished. Tomorrow, she would speak to the one person no one had truly questioned, the solicitor's son. Because sometimes secrets passed not with the dead but through the hands of those who kept their papers. The following morning arrived with a strange brightness. A thin, unfiltered light streamed over St. A dying whisper, a torn psalm, and a will no one was meant to find. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host Alexander. Let's grow this Mr. Loving community. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. I always look forward to hearing from you all. Let's begin. The vicarage lawn in St. Patrick's Rise had seldom looked so festive. Paper lanterns swayed gently from the branches of the hawthorn trees, their delicate crepe shapes casting playful shadows in the summer twilight. Tables were laden with sponge cakes, jellies, and cucumber sandwiches so precisely cut they might have come from Buckingham Palace. Mrs. Weatherby's gramophone trilled out cheerful tunes of another era, and everyone in the village, from the stammering postmaster to the retired Colonel Marchbanks, had gathered in their Sunday best. It was the annual garden party in aid of the new church roof through the roof. As Miss Hartnell-Sowley noted for the third year running, seemed no nearer repair than the day the fund had been started. Still, it was the done thing to attend, and nothing happened in St. Patrick's Rise without everyone knowing, talking, and, most importantly, being seen to know Miss Jane Marple, that genteel, soft-spoken figure of spinsterhood, sat quietly beneath a lilac parasol on the edge of the crowd, her pale blue eyes twinkling as she sipped weak tea. She was staying with her niece for the summer, and although she claimed to find the village rather too overplanned, she never failed to appear where gossip bloomed. Oh, Miss Marple, called Mrs. Dalrymple, bustling over in her peony pink hat. Have you tried the lemon syllabub? Such a triumph. Mrs. Prowse swears it's her late husband's recipe. Indeed, Miss Marple smiled gently. That would explain the generous portion of brandy. I dare say it's less a dessert and more a memory. They chuckled, the sound mingling with the pleasant drone of bees and village chatter. But the tranquillity was broken by a sharp cry. It came from the rose arbor just beyond the trimmed box hedges. A young maid came stumbling out, skirts torn, her white face stark against the green. She clutched her hand to her chest. It's Mr. Simmons, sir. God, it's Mr. Simmons. He's dead. A stunned silence fell over the garden. The gramophone sputtered and stopped. In that breathless hush, teacups were set down, parasols lowered, and curious feet moved toward the arbor like moths to flame. Benedict Simmons had only recently returned to the village after years abroad in Egypt. He was a peculiar man, reclusive and scholarly, known more for his disagreements with the parish council than for his charm. Just last week, he'd caused a stir by insisting on donating a rare old Bible to the church, though he wouldn't say why. Some said he'd found religion, others said he was merely eccentric. He now lay sprawled under the roses, one arm twisted unnaturally behind him, the red blooms around him seeming suddenly garish. Fetch the doctor, someone cried. No, not too late, said Colonel Marchbanks after a cursory inspection. He's gone. Neck snapped, if I'm not mistaken. People began murmuring, gathering in tight circles. He must have fallen, said Mrs. Weatherby shakily. These paths are terribly uneven, or pushed, said Mr. Price, the grocer, darkly. Miss Marple said nothing. Her teacup sat untouched on the saucer. Her eyes lingered on the tangle of roses above the body and the curious sight of a slim, leather-bound volume lying half-concealed in the grass. It was a Bible, and a faded ribbon marked the Book of Psalms. She lowered her parasol slightly. Murder, she said to herself, so softly even the bees didn't pause in their hum. How very unpleasant, and yet quite inevitable. By the time the church bell tolled 6, the vicarage garden had transformed from a place of gaiety into a subdued swirl of speculation and whispers. The bunting still fluttered, but no one looked up. The tables, once crowded with cakes and punch, stood forlornly abandoned. No one touched the trifles now. Dr. Hale had arrived within the half-hour, a stolid man with a neat moustache and a tendency to pronounce the obvious as though it were revelation. After a brief examination, he declared what Colonel Marchbanks had already stated with unnecessary Flourish, yes, he said, rising and brushing imaginary dust from his knees. Neck broken. Death was instantaneous. No sign of a fall or struggle, but the position of the body is, well, quite irregular. Best not move until the authorities arrive. A constable from neighbouring Chillingham was dispatched. And soon after, the county police would follow, but in that golden interim, before the officials took over, the villagers of St. Patrock's Rise began their own investigation, one cup of tea, and confided suspicion at a time. By 7 o'clock, Miss Marple had been offered 3 different accounts of what had happened, each one wrapped in layers of conjecture and personal bias. "Well, I'll say it," announced Mrs. Weatherby as she sat rigidly on the edge of the wicker bench. There was always something not quite right about Mr. Simmons. Foreign ways, if you ask me. I heard he spoke Arabic and all sorts. No good ever comes of that. He only returned 6 months ago, murmured Miss Hartnell, whose voice carried the tone of one who disliked being surprised by anything. And what does he do? Rents that draughty old cottage by the woods, avoids the Women's Guild, refuses to take a pew on Sundays, I ask you. Miss Marple merely nodded, folding her gloved hands in her lap. She had observed Mr. Simmons in the weeks prior to his death, a tall, spare man. With a quick step and sharp cheekbones, he had spoken little, but always seemed to be listening. The sort of man, she had thought, who either carried secrets or avoided others. He was arguing with the vicar last week, Mrs. Dalrymple added suddenly, lowering her voice in a way that made everyone lean in. I saw it with my own eyes, on the church steps. Mr. Simmons waving that Bible of his in the poor man's face, accused him of spiritual cowardice, or something equally dreadful. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Really, the same Bible he brought to donate. Mrs. Dalrymple looked uncertain. Oh, I believe so. Leather-bound, old-looking. He carried it round, as though it were his wallet. The discussion grew livelier from there. Some insisted it was the result of an accident, an unfortunate slip among the uneven paving stones. Others hinted at foul play. Young Timothy Cooper, barely 15 and still sporting jam on his collar, boldly declared it was the work of smugglers. He had no evidence, only a vivid imagination fed by penny novels. And then there was Mrs. Amelia Marchbanks, the Colonel's sister, who maintained a dignified silence until at last she spoke. Her voice clear and oddly cool. Mr. Simmons' maid. Enemies. Quietly, yes, but enemies nonetheless. Not everyone was pleased with his return. You mark my words, everyone turned to her, but she offered no elaboration. Miss Marple noted the woman's tightly pressed lips and remembered hearing that Mrs. Marchbanks had once been engaged, many years ago, to a man who had vanished abroad. She filed the detail away not because it was damning, but because it was human. The police arrived shortly after sunset, their presence casting a sudden chill over the gathering. Inspector Lennox, a broad-chested man with tired eyes, took control. With professional briskness, questions were asked, names taken, statements logged. The garden emptied slowly, people trickling away in 2s and 3s, casting glances back at the rose arbour as if it might bloom another corpse by the time the sun dipped fully behind the hills. The vicarage was quiet again. Miss Marple, however, lingered. She had made her way back to the arbour after the initial crowd had dispersed, with a quiet word to Inspector Lennox about a dropped shawl entirely imaginary. As she reached the spot, she paused, not at the sight of the broken body now, respectfully covered, but at what lay beneath the rose bush. The Bible was gone. That in itself was not unexpected. The police would have surely taken it as evidence, but Miss Marple had noticed something else earlier, a scrap of paper, no larger than a handkerchief corner, had protruded from its pages. A note, a letter, a testament. She had only glimpsed it, yet it had seemed deliberate, as if someone had meant for it to be found. The wind rustled through the arbour, and a petal floated down, landing silently near her feet. She stepped aside and turned back toward the path, that evening, back at her niece's cottage. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room. The lamps were lit, casting warm halos upon the bookshelves. The radio hummed with some distant waltz, and the air smelled faintly of lavender polish and old wood. Her niece, Joan, fussed in the kitchen. Terrible business. She called through the door. I can't think who'd want to harm Mr. Simmons. Not that he was liked, exactly, but murder. In St. Patrick's Rise, unthinkable, Miss Marple didn't answer. She was watching the firelight dance upon the silver edges of a photograph on the mantel. A young soldier, long past, her late nephew. She thought briefly. Another life. Another time. She rose, went to the side table, and took down the worn leather-bound copy of the King James Bible Joan kept for Sunday reading. Thumbing through it, she paused at the Book of Psalms. There was something symbolic about that, a curious man returning from Egypt, a dispute with the vicar, a book containing both spiritual lament and poetic justice. A flower only found in one part of the garden, the west border, near the arbour. Someone picked it in haste. It pressed against the letter Mr. Simmons hid. The note left a trace, but the flower left a witness. The room was silent. The vicar lowered his head. Miss Marple's voice was quiet now, almost kind. I do not think you meant for him to die, but someone else did. And once again she turned to Harold. The room seemed to freeze. Harold stared at her. "Know you were there," she said softly. "You followed him that afternoon, after your confrontation. You saw him go to the arbour. You were angry, afraid. He confronted you again, said he'd spoken to others, that he wouldn't be stopped. You argued. Perhaps you didn't mean to push him, perhaps it was a reflex, but he fell, and then you saw the Bible. You left it there, not thinking it would betray you." Harold was pale now. "I didn't plan it," he whispered. "No," Miss Marple said, "but you acted, and now the truth must follow." Inspector Lennox stood slowly. "Mr. Lacey, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come with me." As the room emptied, Miss Marple remained seated by the fire. No triumph, no gloating, only quiet reflection. The truth had come to light, but not without cost. A man was dead, another disgrace, and the Reverend's quiet concealment would haunt him long after the scandal faded. Outside, night had fallen fully, but within Miss Marple's calm gaze, the last pieces of the puzzle had finally found their place, and all was clear. The news broke quietly, as most things did in St. Patrick's Rise. There was no shouting in the streets, no police cars with flashing lights. The villagers woke to find Harold Lacey gone from his desk at Chilton and Lacey, and the vicar's Sunday sermon delivered by a visiting clergyman from Bodmin. The hush that followed was not one of shock, but of restrained contemplation, as though the village had been expecting it all along, even if they couldn't have said quite what it was. 2 days had passed since the quiet confrontation at the vicarage. Word had spread, as it always did, trickling through afternoon teas and whispering behind hedgerows. By the 3rd day, everyone knew some version of the truth, however distorted by interpretation. But no one confronted Miss Marple. No one challenged her version of events, her calm certainty. Her gentle resolve had become a kind of law in itself, one that the village trusted more than any court or constable. At her niece Joan's cottage, the world had returned to something close to normal. Joan bustled about the kitchen again, happily fussing over preserves and lemon curd. The garden had been weeded, the hedges trimmed, and the roses, which had sagged under the weight of suspicion, now bloomed again with timid optimism. Miss Marple sat by the window in the drawing-room, a small embroidery hoop resting in her lap. She was stitching the edge of a linen handkerchief, white with soft blue, edging a replacement, perhaps, for the one poor Meg had lost near the arbour. Her movements were slow and precise, her expression unreadable but peaceful. Joan stepped in from the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. Aunt Jane. You've had no fewer than 4 invitations to tea this week. You've become a local celebrity. Miss Marple smiled without looking up. Only until the next scandal arrives, Joan sighed, settling into the armchair opposite. It's hard to believe it all happened here. Harold, of all people, and the vicar removed evidence, hiding the letter. Miss Marple nodded gently. People often think sins of omission are less serious than those of commission, but they weigh just as heavily, sometimes more. I still can't quite imagine Harold meaning to kill him. Nor can I, Miss Marple said. I believe it was a moment of panic. A man cornered by his own ambition. Mr. Simmons was pressing, perhaps threatening to expose him publicly, a shove no more than that, but that's all it took. Joan was silent for a moment. And the will, do you think it really existed? Miss Marple paused in her stitching. Yes, she said finally, but it's gone now, destroyed, or perhaps hidden too well to ever surface again. What matters is that its absence caused more damage than its contents ever could have. Outside, the sound of a bicycle bell rang as young Timothy Cooper sped down the lane, shouting to a friend about a frog he'd found. Life had resumed its rhythm that afternoon. Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village. The streets had a washed, clean look to them after the previous night's rain. The bakery windows steamed with fresh bread, the blacksmith's forge glowed faintly, and the post office door jingled with the arrival of Mrs. Weatherby, who never missed a parcel or a piece of gossip. Miss Marple passed quietly, offering polite smiles and receiving them in return. It was the kind of village where people remembered who had helped bring clarity, and who had simply watched. At the church, she stopped briefly. The doors were unlocked, as always, and inside the nave was empty. She walked down the aisle slowly, her shoes whispering over the stone floor. At the front, the Bible sat once more on the lectern. Not Mr. Simmons's. Of course it had been taken for official review, but the church's usual volume, old and weighty. She ran her fingers gently across the pages until she reached the Book of Psalms. Psalm 109, she paused at verse 8, let his days be few and let another take his office. She thought about what that verse had meant to Mr. Simmons, whether it was righteous anger or solemn justice that had guided him. He had not come back for revenge, not entirely. He had come back for resolution, but it was not to be. Miss Marple replaced the ribbon and closed the book. She did not believe in tampering with endings once they had settled. As she stepped back outside, she was met by Meg, the vicarage maid. Standing nervously by the gate, Miss Marple, the girl, asked, cheeks pink with uncertainty, "Yes, dear, I just wanted to say thank you for telling the truth. Everyone said I'd done it, but you didn't believe that." Miss Marple smiled, reaching out and squeezing the girl's hand. Guilt is a heavy coat, Meg. It never fits someone who's innocent. The girl smiled shyly, nodded, and ran off in the direction of the green, where children were beginning a lazy game of rounders. Later that evening, the village held its postponed garden society meeting in the vicarage hall. There was a subdued cheer to the gathering. Lemon sponge and Victoria cake lined the tables. Mrs. Dalrymple wore her green felt hat with the purple feather slightly askew, and Colonel Marchbanks barked a disapproving remark about Lily's being too dramatic for a boarder. Amelia Marchbanks arrived quietly, sitting at the back, no longer the imposing figure she once was, but composed and present. Her pride had taken a bruising, and yet there was something softer about her now. Miss Marple noted the absence of gloves. The conversation drifted, as it always did, from tulip bulbs to pruning shears to rumours about a visiting bishop. It was as if the village, relieved of its burden, had breathed deeply and resumed its slow, steady course. And at the heart of it all sat Miss Marple, silent, observing, smiling gently at the right moments. No one mentioned Mr. Simmons. No one needed to. He had come. He had stirred the waters. And now he was part of the quiet history of St. Petroc's. Rose filed away, whispered about, and folded neatly into the collective memory of the village. That night, as the lamplight flickered against the windows and the wind stirred through the hedgerows once more, Miss Marple sat by her bed and closed her notebook. She had added no new names. No final declarations, only one last line, written in a tidy, graceful script. Truth, like seeds, needs the right moment to bloom. She tucked the notebook into her valise. Tomorrow she will return to St. Mary Mead, but for tonight. She let the quiet surround her, and in the stillness, where mystery had once tangled like briars, there was only peace, and the faint scent of pressed flowers. But it wasn't theology that troubled her, it was the motive. People did not murder for religious philosophy, not usually. They murdered for secrets. And from what Miss Marple knew of life secrets had a way of hiding in plain sight, she sat back, folding her hands once more, and closed her eyes for a moment. Somewhere in the village, someone was sleeping uneasily tonight, someone who had stood among the roses and made a very grave decision, and someone else, perhaps, had read the Testament tucked inside the Psalms. Tomorrow, she decided, would be a day for tea and for asking the right kind of questions, posed with a smile and an innocent curiosity that no one ever seemed to question. Because it was not enough to ask what had happened to Mr. Simmons, one had to ask why now, and what exactly had he brought back with him, besides an old Bible and a reputation for secrets outside. The church bells tolled softly in the wind, and in the stillness of her thoughts, Miss Marple began to form the outline of a pattern, like threads in a tapestry. It was still frayed and faint, but it was there. The morning after the garden party, St. Petroc's rise woke beneath a veil of uneasy quiet. The village, always an early riser, stirred a little more cautiously. Curtains twitched earlier than usual. Doors creaked open with curious hesitation. The milkman, a stooped man with a limp from the war, found himself the recipient of twice as many inquiries as bottles to deliver. At the post office, Miss Hartnell stood behind the counter arranging stamps she'd already alphabetized, half listening to the murmurs of customers as they lingered just a moment longer than needed. At the grocer's, Mr. Price's hand hovered longer than usual over the weighing scale as he strained to hear the chatter between Mrs. Dalrymple and the new schoolmistress. The news had travelled, as news always did in such villages, not in straight lines but in waves, eddying through back doors and passing between teacups. Mr. Simmons was dead, found in the rose arbour, broken neck, a Bible of all things by his side. What no one could quite agree upon was whether it had been an accident or something darker. Miss Marple, ever discreet, had risen early and walked into the village under the guise of fetching more honey. She did not, in fact, care for honey, and her niece Joan had 3 full jars in the larder. But the honey was not the point. The point was movement, observation, and proximity to people whose defences were lowest in the morning. At Mrs. Pendleton's shop, she lingered near the front display of postcards and embroidery thread, while a discussion unfolded by the till. "Well, I don't care what anyone says," said Mrs. Weatherby in her usual voice, which was just loud enough to be considered private only by the deaf. It wasn't a simple accident. He was lying all wrong, and then there's that business with the vicar, Reverend Lionel Humble, a pale, pensive man in his 50s with a thin smile and thinner sermons, had indeed been at odds with Mr. Simmons. Their disagreement, which had apparently taken place on the church steps, had become the favoured topic of speculation, second only to the manner of Mr. Simmons's death itself. I never liked the tone of that man, Mrs. Weatherby continued, brushing non-existent lint from her sleeve. All that business about relics and sacred texts. Obsessed, I'd say, and arrogant. You could see it in the way he held his spectacles, like a man with secrets. Miss Marple moved to the counter with perfect timing, smiling gently. Such a loss, she said mildly. Poor Mr. Simmons, and to think he'd barely settled in. Joan told me he had only just joined the library. Mrs. Pendleton looked up. That's right. Came in asking for theological texts, dry as dust, I thought. But he was always polite, kept mostly to himself. Did he borrow often? No, just once. Only one book. Really, didn't even return it, I don't think. Miss Marple's eyes flicked, unblinking. What was the title? Mrs. Pendleton paused, then turned to her record book with a frown. Let me see, something peculiar. Oh. Yes, Hidden Sayings of the Desert Fathers, old copy, not been touched in years, a curious choice. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then thanked her with a smile and left with her fictitious jar of honey. The bell above the door tinkling cheerfully as it closed behind her, the morning passed slowly. Inspector Lennox, now fully engaged in the case, had taken up residence at the vicarage for interviews. He had a methodical way of asking questions, and an even more methodical way of missing answers that weren't handed to him plainly. Was there anyone? He asked for the third time. Who saw Mr. Simmons before the body was discovered? Only Meg. The maid, said Colonel Marchbanks, who had joined the investigation with the reluctant authority of a retired soldier out of uniform. She was bringing more lemonade to the table. Says she saw a figure near the arbor just minutes before the scream. Couldn't say who, man or woman. She said tall, but that's about it. Could have been anyone. Inspector Lennox sighed. And no sign of the Bible. We've taken it in, said the young constable, peering over the inspector's shoulder. Leather-bound, ribbon in Psalms, just as reported. But no fingerprints, nothing unusual. Was there anything inside? No note, just the ribbon. Inspector Lennox frowned. Odd place for a ribbon. Psalms, what verse? The constable flipped open his notebook. Psalm 109, verse 8, Sir, let his days be few and let another take his office. There was silence. Lennox grunted, cheery. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had taken a rather different route in her quiet inquiries. She sat that afternoon in the garden behind Joan's cottage. A pot of weak tea beside her, and a tin of shortbread she didn't intend to eat. She had invited the schoolmistress, Miss Lydia Crane, to join her, a thoughtful young woman recently arrived from Suffolk, with earnest eyes and an ever-present book. I do hope all this hasn't unsettled your pupils, Miss Marple said, pouring a second cup. Terrible things, violence in a place like this. Miss Crane sipped her tea, her brow creasing. Some of the children have been asking questions. I think Mr. Simmons scared them a little. They didn't quite know what to make of him. Did you? Miss Crane smiled faintly. Not really. He attended one of our community lectures, but didn't stay long. Asked me afterwards if I believed knowledge was dangerous. Did he now? Yes. And he said something odd. He didn't understand it. At the time, he said, even truth becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. Miss Marple's eyes brightened ever so slightly. Curious thing to say. Yes, he had this look deep, searching. It felt as if he was watching not just what I said, but what I didn't. Miss Marple offered a polite laugh and changed the subject, but her mind was turning. The borrowed book from the library, the marked Bible, the cryptic comment about truth, all pointed to a man troubled by something or Sub 1. That evening, as the sun dipped once again behind the rolling hills, Miss Marple took out her notecard case and jotted down a list of names. Mr. Simmons, of course, Reverend Humble, Mrs. Marchbanks, Lydia Crane, the vicarage maid, Meg, and one last name unwritten, but hovering in her thoughts like a shadow. There was still no clear motive, no obvious killer. But there was something Mr. Simmons had feared, something he had perhaps tried to document in his Bible, and something someone had killed to keep hidden. Miss Marple put away her notes and rose. The roses in Joan's garden were blooming there, scent sweet and strangely sharp. Tomorrow she will visit the vicar, not to accuse, only to observe. The next morning dawned with a hush, as though the very clouds over St. Patrock's Rise had learned to tread gently in the wake of murder. The usual village chatter over garden gates and under hedges was replaced with furtive glances and whispered exchanges. Life carried on, as it always did in small English villages, but with that strained sense of normality that followed when something unthinkable had happened. Miss Marple had dressed in her dove-grey cardigan and straw hat, the one with the navy ribbon that suggested just the right note of respectability without drawing attention. She made her way through the village, walking slowly enough to be noticed, but with the mild, thoughtful air of someone preoccupied with her knitting patterns rather than murder. Her destination that morning was the vicarage, the Reverend Lionel. Humble lived alone in a narrow stone house tucked behind the church, flanked by yew trees and a modest rose garden that, unlike the one at the garden party, bloomed with restrained dignity. His front door was open, as it often was, and from inside came the soft clinking of china and the hum of a kettle. Miss Marple knocked gently against the frame. The vicar looked up from his armchair, clearly startled but quick to compose himself. He rose at once and gestured her in. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Do forgive the disarray. The police were only just here again this morning. I won't stay long," she said gently, removing her gloves with the air of someone entering a sick room. "Only I thought you might appreciate a little visit. This sort of tragedy is hard on everyone, especially those in spiritual care." Reverend Humble offered a wan smile. "It is quite a strain. Yes, the burden of peace in a time of confusion. I suppose. Please do sit." She did, settling into a low chair near the fireplace, which still held the faint smell of last night's coal. The vicar poured tea from a pewter pot, his hands a touch unsteady. "I knew Mr. Simmons only slightly," he said, unprompted. He was not a churchgoer, though he was keen on theology, aggressively so. "Our last conversation was not entirely cordial." "So I've heard," Miss Marple murmured, sipping.